Donald Trump appears to be under mounting pressure as tensions with Iran continue to escalate, and according to multiple reports, his push for a ceasefire is being rejected. The latest developments suggest that Trump, through his special envoy Steve Witkoff, has repeatedly tried to open the door to a ceasefire with Iranian leadership. But according to reporting cited in the original coverage, Iran has refused those overtures and is instead projecting defiance, with officials making increasingly aggressive public threats toward Trump himself. The broader picture being painted is one of an Iranian leadership that does not believe it is losing this war. In fact, Iranian officials appear to sense that Trump is the one feeling pressure, especially political pressure at home. That perception seems to be fueling Iran's increasingly confrontational posture as the conflict continues to spread across the region. Iran has kept up its strikes on Israel, and there are also continued reports of attacks tied to U.S. facilities and U.S. interests in the Middle East. One of the most alarming pressure points remains the Strait of Hormuz. There were earlier reports that Iran had been placing mines in the strait, and despite claims from the Trump administration that naval convoys were helping commercial traffic pass through safely, the actual situation appears far more chaotic. According to the original report, very little traffic is moving through the Strait of Hormuz right now. The administration had publicly suggested that U.S. naval assistance was helping stabilize passage for cargo vessels, but those claims later unraveled. In fact, the Trump administration then blamed staffers and interns for social media posts suggesting the Navy had been escorting tankers through the strait, a statement that reportedly added to volatility in the oil markets. At the same time, the conflict appears to be spreading into Iraq. There were reports of a major drone attack on a U.S. diplomatic support facility near Baghdad airport. Security officials said 6 drones were launched toward the compound, with 5 intercepted, but 1 reportedly struck the facility. The site targeted was described as a major logistical hub for American diplomats. Additional strikes were also reported in other parts of Iraq, adding to the sense that the war is widening beyond the original battlefield. There are also indications that even some Israeli defense sources are adjusting expectations. According to the original transcript, an Israeli outlet reported that toppling the Iranian regime now looks less and less realistic, and that the objective may be shifting instead toward weakening or crippling Iran's infrastructure. That is a major contrast with earlier messaging, which had suggested broader ambitions, including regime change. Now, the emerging view appears to be that such an outcome may no longer be achievable. Meanwhile, the confusion surrounding the Strait of Hormuz has had real consequences for global energy markets. A now deleted post from Energy Secretary Chris Wright claimed that the U.S. Navy had helped escort an oil tanker through the strait. That post was erased within minutes, and the Energy Department later said it had been incorrectly captioned by staff. But by then, the damage was done. The markets had already reacted. Oil prices moved sharply, and investors were left struggling to make sense of conflicting signals coming out of Washington. The situation became even more controversial because the statement suggested a level of naval involvement that apparently was not taking place. Later, reporting indicated that the U.S. Navy was in fact not providing those escorts and that such operations were not currently possible. The shipping industry, according to the original report, has been making near-daily requests for help, but the Navy's response has effectively been that escorts through the Strait of Hormuz are too dangerous for now. That means one of the world's most critical energy choke points remains unstable, with no clear solution in sight. There was even speculation in the original segment that someone may have profited enormously from the confusion. As described there, oil dropped sharply after the Energy Secretary's post appeared, only to rebound once the claim was exposed as false and the message was deleted. The suggestion was that a well-timed short position on oil may have generated an enormous profit in just minutes. Whether that was coincidence or something more suspicious, the episode added another layer of distrust around the administration's handling of wartime information. Back in Washington, lawmakers are getting classified briefings on the conflict, and some Democrats are sounding alarms about what they say is a lack of coherence in the administration's war planning. Senator Chris Murphy, after attending a 2-hour closed-door briefing, said the war plans were incomplete and deeply inconsistent. He argued that the administration is keeping too much information behind closed doors because it cannot defend the war publicly. According to Murphy's account, even the central goals of the war are unclear. He said one of the most surprising takeaways from the briefing was that destroying Iran's nuclear weapons program does not appear to be the actual operational objective, despite Trump repeatedly framing that as the main reason for the conflict. Murphy also said regime change is not part of the plan either. If that is true, then the question becomes, what exactly is the goal? As he described it, the focus seems to be on destroying missiles, boats, and drone factories. But critics say that raises an obvious problem. What happens when the bombing stops? If Iran can simply restart production, then the war risks becoming open-ended. Murphy also said the administration had no real plan for reopening the Strait of Hormuz safely, despite the fact that the threat to that passage was entirely foreseeable. That criticism goes to the heart of one of the biggest arguments being made against the Trump administration right now, that it launched or expanded military action without fully preparing for the economic and regional consequences. At the same time, pro-Trump media has begun shifting the conversation. On Fox News, for example, Laura Ingraham questioned why there had not been a popular uprising inside Iran, suggesting that if the regime was under such pressure, the Iranian public should be rising up. But commentary from elsewhere in the region has taken a very different tone. Saudi and broader Arab media, according to the original transcript, have argued that the United States made a military decision without serious political planning. Their view is that instead of weakening the Iranian state from within, the bombing campaign may actually have strengthened national sentiment and reinforced the regime's grip on power. That argument is especially important because it reflects frustration from regional actors who say they were not properly consulted before the war intensified. According to the version presented in the original report, Arab governments believed there had been ongoing diplomatic efforts, including mediation involving Oman, and thought the crisis was moving toward a technical or negotiated phase. Instead, they say, the United States moved into open confrontation, leaving neighboring countries exposed to retaliation and economic disruption. The criticism from those governments is not that they support Iran's attacks. It is that they believe Trump's actions ignored repeated warnings about what would happen next. Their view, as described in the original script, is that Iran's strategy was always to drag the region into a war of attrition and to damage economic interests across the Middle East. In that sense, they argue, Trump walked directly into the trap. Worse still, they believe the result has been to strengthen hardline control inside Iran rather than weaken it. The original report also argues that Trump has further alienated the Iranian public through rhetoric and through the civilian toll of the conflict. It points to claims of attacks on hospitals, schools, and desalination facilities, and argues that instead of encouraging internal dissent against the regime, those actions have fueled anger toward the United States. In that telling, Iran's leadership is now consolidating power under pressure, while nationalism grows stronger in response to outside bombing. And the military danger is still very real. Iran continues to launch missiles toward Israel, including into Tel Aviv. Witnesses described scenes of panic, rolling sirens, and repeated impacts. According to the original segment, one especially concerning development is Iran's use of cluster munitions. These are warheads that break apart into multiple bomblets, making them harder for missile defense systems such as Patriot and THAAD to intercept. Even Fox correspondents on the ground in Tel Aviv acknowledged that this tactic is changing the nature of the threat. Iranian media, meanwhile, has reportedly escalated its propaganda messaging as well, mocking Trump directly and trying to frame the war in terms of broken promises to the American people. The message, according to the original script, is that Americans were promised affordability and no endless wars, but are instead getting both instability abroad and pain at home. The transcript then pivots into several domestic political developments, using them to argue that the Trump administration is under pressure on multiple fronts. One example mentioned is Attorney General Pam Bondi, who according to the original report has moved out of her Washington apartment and is now living on a military base because of threats and fears tied to multiple controversies, including her handling of the Epstein files. The script presents that as part of a broader image of Trump-aligned officials isolating themselves behind security while the country faces growing unrest. There is also international fallout. Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney reportedly stated in Parliament that Canada would never participate with the United States in an offensive war against Iran. That would mark a significant signal of distance from Washington, showing that even close allies are uneasy with the direction of events. On the domestic front, the transcript also highlights controversial comments from Republican Senator John Husted of Ohio, who suggested that people living in poverty often lack experience navigating the real world and need to be taught how money works. In the original report, those comments are framed as part of a wider Republican message that dismisses the struggles of ordinary Americans at a moment when economic anxiety is rising. The script also says that within the White House, there are signs Republicans are trying to recalibrate politically. Deputy Chief of Staff James Blair reportedly urged House Republicans to stop emphasizing mass deportations in public and instead focus their message on removing violent criminals. The implication is that the administration may be worried that its broader agenda is becoming politically toxic, especially as voters focus more on war, affordability, and abuses of power. And finally, the original segment closes by pointing to special election results as evidence that something may be shifting politically. In Georgia's 14th District, the home district of Marjorie Taylor Greene, the Democratic candidate was reportedly performing far better than expected, enough to suggest that even deep red territory may be becoming competitive. In New Hampshire, Democrats flipped a state house seat in a district Trump had previously carried, with turnout described as unusually strong. The argument being made is that public backlash may be building, and that voters are responding to the combination of war, secrecy, economic instability, and political extremism. So, taken together, the picture presented in this report is one of a Trump administration facing rising instability abroad and growing political blowback at home. Iran is refusing to back down. The Strait of Hormuz remains dangerously disrupted. U.S. war aims appear increasingly unclear. Allies are uneasy. Markets are rattled. And as the conflict drags on, critics say the administration is making a dangerous situation even worse.